Welcome back to Infinite Geek Talk, an ongoing conversation between your hosts, former DC Comics editor and owner of Infinite Heroes in Watertown, Connecticut, Paul Santos, who is joined by Keith Field, co-founder of Gorilla Valley Games and the owner of Rat's Nest Studios. Let's listen in.
Looks like what was the knockoff? You might know this. Who was like the knockoff Roger Rabbit from like the pre-Roger Rabbit? He was white.
Was there a time machine involved in putting the knockoff before the main character?
Well, because it's like he looked like a drunk Roger Rabbit with like a buck tooth. He was a white-skinned rabbit with like reddish hair. He may have been the inspiration for Roger Rabbit.
I really want to chirp up because I feel it would give me a sense of manly power if I immediately caught this reference, but I have no friggin' idea who this knockoff time-traveling Roger Rabbit was.
I feel like it's like a
Rabbit?
Who created Woody Woodpecker?
Fritz Freeling?
I feel like it's a Fritz Freely character.
Okay. Well, you know what I will say?
obscure-
You know, I'm going to kind of defend you in a weird way.
Right.
And say that in the 80s, there were a lot... Yeah, a video game term is shovelware. A lot of junk gets turned out. There were so many Saturday morning franchises that were all terribly derivative of each other. Any number of cartoons that turned out to have been secretly written by Paul Dini may indeed have featured a drunk rabbit with red hair.
I feel like it was like a Woody Woodpecker
very well
side character that no one ever cared about.
We'll call him Drunky Bunny.
But
he
he
had no
looked
time for his crap.
But yeah, the pixels in the NES game made him look like a zombie.
Like Drunky Bunny.
Yeah, like a zombie drunken rabbit. I will say Jessica Rabbit, again, because the 80s and 90s, looked great. They pixelated her. I'm like, wow, they actually got away with cleavage and a...
I was going to say, without being inappropriate, there's really only two features you need to get right for Jessica Rabbit.
Though on the slit...
Good work, LJN.
The slit on her dress, too, was like really...
Well, maybe that's one of the two.
You
I
know.
wasn't being untoward. This is a family podcast.
Right.
Well,
if you do
good work. That
yourself,
impresses me, even though I have only vague recollections of it.
I mean, do yourself a favor, and however you could find it, look at either watch a YouTube or play it,
done.
and you'll be shocked at how bad that game is.
I will do so because it's disturbing to me that I have foregone all forms of traditional media at this point in my life. I pretty much just watch talking heads on YouTube talk about video games. So.
I had to do a Legend of Zelda. I had to do an original, like get a piece of graph paper and start writing down what building, like make a map of the world.
Yeah.
And start marking down which buildings I went into so that, all right, I've already been there, don't have to go there. Because because you get so far easily.
Well,
like you get to a certain point where you're like, no, I'm beating this game.
You actually do bring up a thing that's hard to eloquate at times. I've had this conversation with friends that back in that day, the sweet spot, the mid 80s, the rise of Nintendo and all that jazz. When you sat down to play a game, you didn't do it like you did today. You just sort of let it overwhelm you. And you would lose yourself in the little glowing world of electric light. And in the course of that, you didn't always begin a game with a calm, paced, and reasonable assessment of relationships and where you were going. And for a lot of people, Zelda was the first game that made you wake up halfway through it and say, oh, I haven't been playing right. I'm not really watching what I'm doing.
Right.
If I had just kind of watched where I was in relation to the first level at any time, I might have been able to beat this game in days as opposed to weeks. And then you watch your first 10-minute playthrough and realize, yeah, see, that you could do that instead. But that was the first game that started you on that path of like, sit down and immediately begin checking, drawing those relationships and kind of mentally mapping.
Right.
So I could see that because I definitely jackassed around in that game a lot longer than I needed to. But I think the king of jackassing around in those blind alleys / you can beat this game in 5 minutes if you don't was Metroid, the original.
Oh.
For the NES.
Yeah.
Which if you remember, so as to avoid potential of, quote, falling through the world, which is to say blasting your way into some oblivion quarter of a level, the levels didn't end.
Right.
It would just keep mapping more levels and more terrain if you went into areas that would have otherwise been, quote, negative space. So I had friends who had notebooks full of maps, and that's why I bring it up, of what they had unlocked during the course of their long overnight Metroid explorations.
It's one of the reasons why I love the NES, but the older I get, the more I'm like, I think I like the 16-bit era better.
Oh, I don't think you're wrong to. I mean, I think that there are emotional affections, and then there's a truth that eventually hits you of like, yeah, I'll always love this more, but let's face it, this was the better deal.
Especially since almost every major NES game has a Super NES counterpart.
And the Super NES, I would mark as the dawn of the current video game generation. I mean, obviously, I don't mean that literally, but just as the first next-gen game that worked in a mainstream audience, it then set the standards for how this whole thing works.
Well,
the constant evolution of systems, the expectation that you're going to get a new version of your system within 3 to 5 years.
And they still sell, they're better than 16-bit, but they're 16-bit lookalikes, like the Scott Pilgrim game or the new
retro quote unquote flavor. And I love those games. My thing is just make sure that there's a game or some sort of standard under that surface. It's not enough just to do the blocky graphics and all that, because if you remember, they even started to like retro flavor games so that they looked more crude or 8-bit during the 16-bit era.
Oh,
like, nah, you want to be a few steps ahead.
That I did not like.
River City Ransom is not a good game, people.
Oof.
That's right. I stand by that, and I will die on that hill. It's not enough to just make your characters look like super deformed cherubs. It has to be fun as well. The fact that they heal by eating sandwiches is not fun, but we will not go on the weird tangent.
You brought up a good point, too, about side-scrollers. Isn't it weird? Or I don't know if it's weird, but
it's weird. What is it?
Your opinion on why almost every beloved comic book game is a side scroller?
Because people are stupid.
Okay.
I mean, by people, I mean game developers. Yeah, it's just that I think it's probably the ease of programming.
There's so many of them, especially the 16-bit era.
And they're all basically the same game, right? So you don't have to innovate. Some are better than others because some of them have. I look at it as, was the game fully developed in Japan? Because if it is, it's heads and tails better than a lot of the rest of what we got, license-wise or side-scroller-wise.
Well, because Maximum Carnage, to bring it back, the arcade game...
Acclaim!
The arcade game is much, much better.
It's a different animal,
You could beat it in with $10.
Well, see, now you bring us back to our meat and potatoes. You bring us back to our beloved Superfolk in that, you talk about license games and the disappointments that come with them. There have been so many comic-themed games over the decades, from the beginning. And of them, such a tiny, tiny percentage have worked. And if we were going to use that as a jumping-on point, I would suggest, to answer what you were just talking about, that inability to innovate and to say, okay, what's the quickest path from concept to market? Just throw together a side-scroller. In some cases, we're reskinning the same garbage.
Right.
Two games, multiple games developed at the same time. Okay, we've developed these 27 levels of side-scrolling Marvel. Now let's split it into games and skin it. It's easier to do.
Right.
I get it. That's just business. But when you have the unlimited potential and unchecked wonder and imagination that stuffs girls into refrigerators, born of the Marvel and DC Comics universe, you'd think you could do something better than a clumsy side-scroller. And DC, you certainly think you'd never see a side-scrolling Batman game where his primary attack is to shoot a gun. But we saw it in Sunsoft's Batman on the Game Boy. Everyone seems to miss the point, and I think it's worth looking at some of these examples and discussing the love and sorrow that they've engendered in us.
And it's funny because DC does not have a lot of side-scrolling
but the majority of DC's entries into the world of video gamery are modern. Those that aren't, we'll discuss, because I think we'll find plenty of them.
I love
side-scrollers.
The Death of Superman arcade game. And
I think we can put together a chronology, Paul. I think just our awesome powers of recollection will be enough that we can build a continuity of thought here. So I'm gonna drag deep, and I want you to comment on these jewels as I throw my gaze backward. I believe the first superhero games that I would point to that made any kind of major resonance were back on the Atari 2600 and the hated Intellivision. But the majority of what we will discuss here, because it's all that matters, so it's our Atari entries. The two that I immediately think of were Superman for the Atari 2600. Now, I would pause there. Did you ever play Superman on the 2600?
No, I have not. I know of it, but I've never played it.
Now, in the same way that our friends at LJN had a family of you drive around in a car, go in a building, and a character from this franchise talks to you or it stares at you while you jump over beetles, so too was there a type of game at Atari. in which you are a small character. I'm not going to bash the Atari's capabilities,
Right.
simply say that you are the little hero character. You are moving about a little kingdom or city that is represented in vague background graphics.
Mhm.
You have to collect a variety of items, which are usually fragments of a larger item, and then drag it back to the starting space. Now, if you've played 2600 games, you know that I've now described 3/4 of the Atari 2600 games. But if you wanted some proof in the pudding examples, Adventure
Right.
begins this trend. It continues with Haunted House, which apparently there was a sequel for. Who knew? There was also a sequel for Adventure, but it is what it is. E.T.,
A video game that lets you help E.T. get home.
the much shamed and stone-cast poor E.T.
The worst video game of all time.
Just in time for Christmas.
Well, there are those who would say so. I would suggest that Chinese Kung Fu Heroes has far less integrity than our friend E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And the Sword Quest games, which were developed in coordination with our friends at DC. But Superman was one of those games. And in this case, it was Lex Luthor blew up a bridge. So you flew from screen to screen, collecting the pieces of the bridge. Then you flew them back to the starting screen, and it built. You would go into little phone booths to turn from Clark Kent into Superman. And then floating around the levels were kryptonite bombs that if they touched you, you turned from Superman back into Clark Kent and had to go find another booth. And there were criminals running around that would kill you, and without much explanation. It was one of those Atari games that transcended the simplicity of its presentation, spiritually got things right. Superman has a cape. I can tell he's Superman. That's not necessarily something that the Nintendo would achieve later with the release of Superman for the NES, a game that will traumatize anyone who looks upon it, but we're not there yet.
Right.
The other of these first games, to judge the rest, is one that I have never played, but I'm familiar with, so maybe you have. I speak of Spider-Man for the 2600.
I've played Spider-Man.
Tell me about it, Paulie, because I've never played the damn thing.
It's very odd, as most Atari games are. You basically have to web up buildings.
It's like Crazy Climber, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's basically
For those who don't know, the whole game is just the face of a building and you're climbing up the windows.
Basically, criminals are in the windows trying to kill you.
Yep.
I think it's birds also try to kill you.
I would be surprised if they weren't.
You make it to the top of the building, and the Green Goblin is always there throwing little bombs at you, and then you just have to web them a couple times. Rinse and repeat.
Okay.
Probably for infinity.
Yep.
You know?
That's a standard Atari formula.
Yeah,
But what's the verdict? Was it a good Atari game?
It's fun because it's fun webbing up the buildings because it's like Crazy Climbers.
Yeah.
It's like it has little
if
noises.
they get any
little...
part of the experience of Crazy Climber right, that was an odd tongue twister,
Right.
then the game is worth its salt.
Yeah, and
because that's basically the judge of every Atari game. Did it get its one gimmick right?
Yeah, and you can tell it's Spider-Man because it's red and blue. The pixels are red and blue.
Sure.
So that's the end of that.
That was the thing that struck me the most about Superman, though. Is you knew it was Superman. They did the cape just right.
I think I've seen it in a like a angry video game nerd.
Yeah.
For Superman, I don't think I remember him doing Spider-Man, but he probably did.
Either way, they were the two sides of the coin. Plenty of licensed games for the Atari as well. The irony here is that licensed games back in the day were much better than the modern.
Well, because they weren't, like I said, they weren't clones. Although again,
Discs of Tron, best game for the Atari 2600.
some of them were better than others.
It was just called
You
Tron.
mentioned the Batman games are great for Nintendo.
Oh well, if we are then going to spring forward, before we get to the Nintendo proper, I would say that right after the Atari and television era, we would face the initial home computing wave.
Oh yeah.
And back then, in a world of home brews and small publishers, there were a surprising amount of licensed properties that would be a part of the comic or, dare I say, enthusiast genre. But rather than go about all of them, the two that I will point to as making an impact on me as I move down the highways and byways of this man's America would be G.I. Joe, which I played on the Commodore 64.
Oh right.
And there was a G.I. Joe for the Atari as well, but it was the one in the 64 that hit me as an appropriately remembered game. Because it had a lot of the conventions of modern games before they were things. There was a character select screen. You could play as the Native American fellow whose name eludes me. I'm not a huge G.I. Joe guy. I'm a fan of the Baroness, and that's where it ends. But it was
Spirit.
him, and he fought Storm Shadow on his level. It was like a little proto fighter with no real mechanics or anything, but it looked really nice.
Right.
So G.I. Joe always gets an honorable mention from me. The other was that there were licensed Marvel games for the PC. The two worthy of mention, in my opinion, were the Quest Probe games and Captain America versus, I believe it was the Dungeon of Dread, but I could be totally wrong on that. It could also be the Maze of Menace or the, I don't know, Cabana of Cannibalism. It's one of those things, but it's Captain America, both of which I played on the 64. The Captain America game is only memorable because it was basically an early version of a text point-and-click game hybrid.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, it was very childishly simplistic. The only reason I remember it is because years later, one of those app games that came out, one of those Marvel app thing, buy, play, pay-to-win things, I will say all their pay-to-win games are surprisingly engaging. But in this one, they had ongoing plot lines through a season. So they did a season where a Scourge-like entity was murdering low-rung villains in the Marvel Universe. I enjoyed the selection they made. And one of the characters in that selection was the villain from that Captain America game that came out from the 64 all those decades before.
That's funny.
I'm a big fan of that kind of dig. The other, for the PC's Quest Probe, was this odd series of games that was supposed to come out that was made in collaboration with Marvel, in which this dome-headed character, whose name eludes me at the moment, give me 10 minutes, looked very much like Mysterio. The Prime Assessor or some jazz along those lines. But this dome-headed witness would materialize and either manipulate, interfere, or just witness an encounter between a hero and some villainous force, that it was a test he was putting people through. He was accompanied by a flying monolith like 2001. And it was pretty deep. You had comic folks working on it. I mean, that certainly suggests that there's some level of investment here.
Right.
The first one was a Spider-Man game. The next was a Hulk game. And that character, the Prime Investigator, that's not his name, I'm just spitballing, actually wound up in Marvel continuity. He would show up in the Marvel handbooks and all that. So, and I believe, given the fact that the creator in question was Mark Grunwald, that character and plotline was addressed in Quasar years and years later too. So that's a neat way that a license came back and became real.
Fun fact too, Marvel for a while tried to keep this, everything is in continuity.
Yes.
So not only were the games in continuity, the paperback books would be in continuity.
That's
if
correct.
you go on the wiki, or I think they've scrubbed it now, but on the Marvel Appendix has all those books as in continuity appearances of villains and whatnot, which is interesting.
One big one that I think is interesting on that topic was there were a pair of Sinister Six novels that were written a few years ago. And all of the original characters and concepts from those books have found their way into Marvel continuity.
Right.
I like that sort of thing.
No, me too.
I believe in including stories, not in finding reasons to jettison.
I think
that's always neat to see.
I think what broke it is that a bunch of the X-Men novels contradicted.
Well, ultimately, they all break down, don't they?
Yeah, and they were like, "Oh, we can't ever say this happened for real." So then all of them never happened,
right?
Which was interesting.
It's an all or nothing. So after the PCs, now we get to our Nintendo, where there's every damn game in the world. I want to hear some of your favorite superhero experiences on the NES, if you have any. You can count that rabbit, because we don't have it on any authority that it was actually Roger.
Well, that was...
He may have been a little boy bitten by a radioactive rabbit.
I will say...
Created by Fritz Freeling.
As I said before, all the Batman games were great. I loved
Batman
all of them.
Sunsoft, you started to talk about, and that's what I wanted to come back to, so we might as well start with it. That game rocks all possible socks and should be far more beloved than it is.
Yes.
Sunsoft is an exceptional company, was an exceptional company. Master Blaster, one of the greatest games ever made for any system ever.
Go on Wikipedia and read what that game is actually about. And you're like, I did not get that from that game as a child at all.
No, I knew the stakes when I went up against the Plutonium boss. But Blaster Master was awesome. When they announced that they were getting the Batman game after Tim Burton's Batman, I was bouncing off the walls.
Oh,
this is going to be the best thing ever. And guess what? I was right. That weird Batman is one of my favorite versions of Batman.
It's one. They've made a NECA does these cool figures based on video games.
Yeah.
of licensed stuff. So Freddy, Jason, Predator,
Yep.
and they did a Batman one, and I almost got it.
Of
the
Nintendo Batman?
Yeah, because he's purple. It's the NES, not very detailed with color or stuff like that, or
Shake my
sprites.
head in disdain.
So
Almost bought it.
the sprite is completely purple.
That's awesome.
And it looks great.
That's
and
awesome.
it did a really,
The fact you didn't buy that, once again, my respect for you drops.
I have so many action figures. That's
It
the
drops.
problem.
Yeah. You should have so many +1, and that
Right.
+1 should be that beautiful, beautiful Sunsoft Imagined
I
Batman.
could probably find
you
it.
fair-weather fiend. You better find it. I think that's neat.
It comes with a gun too, which I heard was very controversial at DC.
Well,
when it
I
came
made
out.
a snide joke about it earlier, but the fact is, that's one of the things I loved about the Sunsoft Batman, is that not so much in that game, but he does use a gun in that game.
Right.
In the Game Boy game that came out at the same time, it's a totally different game, but he still uses a gun.
Yeah.
The gun is his primary attack throughout it, and that game rocks.
Yeah.
Because the end villain is eventually the Joker, but throughout the game, you're fighting Jack Napier. And the fact that they took my least favorite thing about the movie Joker and turned it into the core of the game elevated it. Again, it's a Morrisoni. It's you're taking a weak element and you're making it a great A idea. It was just so cool.
It's always fascinating to me how many people hate, how many comic fans hate the Jack Napier stuff, and every mainstream Batman fan loves the Jack Napier stuff. And I'm always like,
I now find myself happily accepting of it.
I love it. I've always loved it.
I'm now of the opinion of, this is kind of counter our 90s affection.
Right.
That I would really be happy with a Joker who doesn't kill people. I'm really sick of the intense, extreme, hyper-violent stuff in mainstream comics. So if we could have a Joker who is demystified, that we know his real name, we know the very real origins he came from, I think that's a Joker I can start to love again. So if I knew his name was Jack Napier, I think that's cool, because it's making a silk purse out of an awkward sousy.
And that doesn't get rid of the Red Hood origin.
Of course not.
For people who don't know,
the guy in the hood was named Jack.
Yeah, for people who don't know, in comics, the Joker was an unnamed hood called the Red Hood. He wore a big red hood over his face, and he falls in the vat of acid because of Batman.
Yep.
In the Tim Burton movies, his name was Jack Napier. He killed Bruce's parents. He was like a gangster hitman.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't really like a mafioso guy. He was a hitman.
Right.
Funny fact, Bruce Timm, one of the creators of the Batman animated series,
Indeed.
that's the Joker origin for the DC animated universe. Is
Yeah.
that he was a hitman. He was never the Red Hood, I don't think, and then he falls in the vat.
Other sources, I'll point curious people to like the JLA Watchtower. I know those guys maintain a decent continuity-based animated series site on YouTube and elsewhere. They were talking about this a few months ago as well. And something that they spoke to, one of the things I knew, and that was that early on, the whole deal as the series was coming together, it went through a lot of permutations, but one of those things was they wanted to keep continuity with the Tim Burton stuff as much as possible. And that's why you had the webbed hand Penguin in the first couple of seasons of the animated series. And that's why there is an episode in which Batman is thrown into Arkham, and a doctor is trying to convince him that he is ill. And during the course of that episode, he names off the real names of a bunch of the villains. These aren't villains. These are sick people.
Right.
Pamela Isley, Jervis Tetch, Jack Napier.
Right.
And that was neat. Because, again, it's taking the thing that you don't particularly care for, and it's making it indelibly part of this thing. It can't be ignored.
Right.
I find that when that happens, it usually does engender a satisfactory result. And I definitely think it did in the case of animated Joker Boy.
Right. And as being a huge, as much as being a DC Comics guy, and I do like the Red Hood.
Yep.
The Tim Burton, Bruce Timm, Jack Napier is such a much more interesting character.
Yeah.
Even the Killing Joke stuff with like, oh, is he a comedian? Or is he a mobster? Or is he? It's like it doesn't matter. I don't care about any of those versions of him more than I do the Tim Burton version.
I just like a Joker that doesn't throw babies into meat grinders.
I think
It's just my way.
I think that day has ended.
That day has ended long ago,
Yeah.
my friend. Long ago. I thought 3 Jokers might bring us back closer to some version of that, but alas, it did not. But the Jack Napier Joker is the villain of the Sunsoft games. And spoiler, those of you who beat the NES version will see Batman grab the Joker by the lapels and willingly hurl him to his death at the end of the game. I got to tell you, As much of an aversion as I have toward wholesale slaughter, that's a death that matters. Because, the Joker's drowned too many babies to be allowed to walk away from that cathedral.
Well, I think that's what's funny too is that they did a sequel called Return of the Joker, Revenge of the Joker, and a Batman Returns video game.
Yes.
So that Batman '89 game is a weird, like, what is this? Is this an adaptation?
None of this carries any of the cool spirit of the wonderful game that I fought the Electrocutioner in.
Right.
Come on, that's a game.
But that's probably my favorite NES game. I mean, the Ninja Turtle game, the second Ninja Turtles game on NES is really, really good.
The second one is.
Yeah.
That was the one that was based on the arcade
game.
And it worked. They actually added a level or two from what I remember.
Yes.
It was really solid.
On the third, and the often forgotten third one, basically the same thing. Side-scroller, it's arcade.
Obviously even better graphics as time went on. But I would say the second one was probably my favorite.
I do like the Captain America and the Avengers game.
Captain America and the Avengers. Now, you played it like all good-hearted people in an arcade.
Yeah, and I played the NES version, too.
All right. So the NES version obviously didn't compare. But at least Atari style gave you the flavor at home.
Well, yeah, at least it wasn't. I remember as a kid. You want to hear my biggest disappointment as a kid for video games?
Very much so. Cry for me, Paul.
The X-Men arcade game. It was the first time I'd seen an arcade game where I'm like, I had like a religious experience. Like, this is the best.
Is this
game.
real?
Right.
Or am I dreaming?
Right. I think it was more like, am I dying? Is this like, this is it?
Is this what heaven is? Because if it is, it's kind of pathetic that it's just an impressive video game.
And this is before I'd beaten the game.
Right.
And I remember being in Toys R Us in Waterbury one day, and you see X-Men for the NES. And your stupid 10-year-old brain, or however old I was like, oh my God, I could buy the NES version. It'll be the exact same thing from the arcade game.
Lesson learned, Roger Rabbit.
The worst part was that I did not get this game through gifts. I had to earn it through like money, like mowing lawns or whatever, which made me buying it and then putting it in and going, oh no, what is this? For those who haven't played it, and they marketed it.
I feel for you.
They were smart because the cover looks like the arcade game. There are no screenshots on the back, or very few. So you have no idea what this game is. And then you plug it in and you're like, oh, it's a top-down, platformer. What?
Do you know what your problem is? It's that you didn't go through the pain of the Atari 2600.
Oh, Richard, I could have said it no better myself. Continue.
If you had known the bait and switch of Atari 2600 cover art versus what you got, you would know better.
Yeah.
Those are sage words.
Yeah.
You look at the box, you see two half-naked barbarians of ample frame, locked in combat, with a two-headed dragon being ridden by a robotic Grim Reaper. You put it in your system, you're playing Breakout. This was the lie of Atari. And obviously, Paul, you were just that year or two too young to have been once bitten and twice shy.
It almost broke me on video games. I still remember being like so mad. And this is like early 90s NES. The game looks like it was made in like 1986. And I'm like, it's 1991, man. Like, or 90. I'm like, what is happening?
Like all good-hearted people, you had an NES, but there were plenty of soulless monster people who stood behind the Genesis. Oh, no, I said that into a microphone.
Do you mean the Master System or the Sega?
Anything with the Sega name that was not followed by Dreamcast is a mark of dishonor for any of the sad, contrary monsters who pretended to like any game ever placed on any Sega system.
As I'm looking at your Sonic Legos.
There are exceptions to every rule. When you build anything in Lego form, it is immediately forgiven. I will tell you, I've only ever bothered to beat a single Sonic game, but I have tried every one because they're not games. They are weird stimulation exercises for the slow and confused. I'm good at playing a game. I beat the first 7 levels of Sonic. All you have to do is push right and close your damn eyes. They're not games.
Also, can you talk about this is why I think I sometimes have a mental disorder?
No, you do, but go on.
The Sonic 2 trailer. I'm very happy Tails is in it. I was very annoyed, but pleased that Knuckles is in it because Knuckles doesn't come out until Sonic 3. And that's how my brain works. And I hated myself for being so mad.
No, you were right.
But I was mad.
You were
I'm
right
like,
to hold on to
why
that
are we
that lie.
It's like,
It
why are
would
we
be
ruining
like
this?
The rabbit that video game Roger Rabbit was based on coming out 10 years before the game.
Right.
I mean, these things happen, Paul.
It's just
Thank God you noticed
It's
them.
just madness. It's like, you have Tails in the second one. Why are you rushing Knuckle? It's just, to me, Hollywood is
Look,
not thinking the way as a madman.
Here's why I can never
Is.
fully love the Sonic franchise. And it has nothing to do with those questionable films or
Right.
the increasing madness of Jim Carrey. It has to do with the fact that when these games came out in the US, what was the villain's name?
Dr. Robotnik.
That's correct. But is that his name, Paul?
No, I don't.
His actual name, I am here to tell you, is Dr. Eggman.
No, I know.
And that was eventually fixed as the games went on. I think there might have even been a little jokery in one of the rule books trying to play some sort of reference to this and say, he's done using the alias Robotnik or some crap like that.
Yeah, his alien on the wiki, because I've gone on the Sonic
Yes.
wiki. Be careful when you Google Sonic, kids, just for future reference.
Indeed.
Robotnik's name is like whatever his first name is, Eugene or something. And
it's a weird name. It's like Glaglio.
right.
Something
It's some
odd, I don't
weird.
know.
And then it's like parentheses.
Olivio Robotnik.
It's parentheses Eggman
Yes.
Robotnik.
It's
like Eggman is like his alias.
No, Eggman's his name.
Well,
It's reversed. Robotnik was an Americanized name because
Right.
they thought Eggman
Right.
wouldn't wash. But they undid it because now he's exclusively Eggman. And his constitution does involve an actual egg.
well, and his
Sonic has a terrible, weird backstory.
Right.
I mean, there's the simple backstory of Planet Mobius, Chaos Crystals, little animals, I don't care. Not a real game, you're all dumb. But then there is a deeper history that I've only heard bits and pieces of. It's all out there on the Wikipedias to find.
right.
That involves things like Sonic wasn't born a hedgehog. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly the case, but it's that weird.
Yeah,
So
he's
in
like
that
a
same
boy.
spirit, I know that Robotnik was an egg. Now, why does this bother me as someone who just has no time for Sonic anyway? I hate when any franchise confuses the name of a character and then the fan base is now stuck with these two character names,
Oh.
not knowing how to reconcile. The better example of this, of course, being the Bluto Brutus situation that comes out of Popeye, which is also one of the finest games ever made for the 80s arcade, the ColecoVision, the Super Nintendo or regular Nintendo.
Yeah, very good games.
Popeye rocks.
You know, there's a new one that sucked that came out last year, right?
last year,
Yeah.
did it try to be a platformer as the traditional
This
Popeye?
is worse.
What is it?
It's an asset flip where you're just collecting hearts on an island,
Ugh.
and Bluto comes to like punch you, and that's it.
Now, Paul, I've paid you some praise in the past, but I'm here to tell you I'm very proud of you because 2 seconds ago, you used the proper name for the character in question. His
Right.
name is Bluto.
I don't understand.
It ain't Brutisk.
I don't understand. And I was a kid.
Anybody who says Brutisk is obsessed with the Channel 5 cartoon from the 70s and should grow to frig up. His name is Bluto. That's his name from the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, so when I was
that involves being a grown-up.
So when I was a kid on syndication, they were showing the old ones
Yep.
because I didn't watch the new ones till I was like in
Yep.
high school. I'm like, what the hell is this?
In my time, it was a mix of both. So you'd have
You had
like
both.
Fleischer stuff, and then you'd have the 60s stuff, and you'd have the 70s stuff. I can
Right.
see Rich has the same memory, so you'd get it both ways.
So we,
And you're sitting there like, no, you're violating your continuity. This is very important to 4-year-old Keith Field.
when I was a kid, I remember Popeye was mixed with another cartoon that I'm forget, not
that happened a
not
lot.
Superman, but that's what I mean. That's probably
It
why I
would be
didn't
like
get
the Popeye Woody Woodpecker show.
right. Yes,
Those
actually,
syndicated-
that's probably
those
what
are
it was.
syndication packages.
Yeah,
And then,
But I wouldn't get the
on
60s.
Saturday morning, they'd mash even more crap.
I wouldn't get the 60s and 70s versions though, for
really?
until
Yeah.
much later on.
The only thing I liked about them was they used, not that I'm some sort of Popeye purist, though I suppose I'm more of a Popeye purist than most people, and, ultimately,
It's crazy how many characters
this
are
is
in
why
that.
I live a very challenging life.
It's crazy
But,
how
yeah,
much
they introduced the
characters.
Sea Hag in the 60s.
Right.
And so it was another, and Alice the Goon and some other stuff from the traditional real cartoons.
Right.
Like the Fleischer cartoons had goons in them, and they were very accurate, but then you didn't see them again. And then you saw the female-friendly goons and all that. But, and Eugene the Jeep and Poop Deck Pappy and some of the other characters that now, as a result, lots of people know. Nobody knows Ham Gravy, but they know the other ones. Or Olive Oil's disturbing extended family. But
What was that? What was that thing that always it just created itself into food for people to eat? Was that you? Was that Eugene the Jeep?
now Eugene was like he was the Popeye Mitzelplick, but he was friendly. He was a little creature who could alter reality.
What was the creature that like you could eat off? Like you could cut off a leg and then eat it.
I'm not remembering a Popeye character like that. I certainly remember the Dog Patch Ham, which was the foodstuff of Little Abner.
Maybe
who was a little living ham that he would happily cut off pieces of
maybe
himself
that's
for
what I'm.
people to eat.
Maybe that's what I'm
Which
thinking.
you could very well be right as well. There could have
Yeah.
been some sort of food source in Popeye. Ultimately,
That's a weird great. That must
as
be
much as I might know or not know about Popeye. I'm just a casual fan.
That must be some sort of weird Great Depression era, like
Infinite food.
Yeah, infinite. Like
It's not the Great Depression. It starts with Norse mythology.
Well, right.
Thor's eating his goats every day and having them grow back.
I'm talking about in America.
No, just the idea of infinite food as a character in your culture or mythology
Yeah.
is a thing. There's always hungry people. There will be poor always, Paul, pathetically suffering. I forget who said that. But I do know this. The Dog Patch Ham on principle. Now, I've never read a Little Abner comic, but I know quite a bit about Little Abner
right.
just as a student of the nerd arts. The Dog Patch Ham transitioned from my need to ever read any of those comic strips to a hero who I carry in my heart. The idea of a living ham is very important to the aesthetic of Keith Charles Field, friend of ham, much less a ham that willingly self-sacrificed itself. From what I understand, the Dog Patch Ham eventually throws itself in the path of a pullet and dies, and the American people went insane. Now, that does open up an interesting subtopic of the world of comic bookery. Have you ever been talking to an old person? Now, you own a comic book shop about like old comic strips or old comic book ideas, and you're shocked when they suddenly have this happy glow and start pulling what you think are obscure ideas out of their ass. And you're like, Grandpa, I hate you. As far as I know, you're just a witless drunk who may or may not have robbed a bank in '82. I didn't know you knew who B.O. Plenty and Gravel Gertie were. I guess you really did read Dick Tracy when you were young. You realize just how big comic strips were to like the grandparents or great-grandparents' generation.
Yeah.
And how much they still damn remember.
Well, they also keep thinking that comic books are just comic strips.
Sure.
Which hasn't been a thing since the 1920s.
Exactly. But then to learn they were actually invested in those characters in the 20s is neat. When you meet some old codger who could actually talk intelligently about Terry and the Pirates, that's neat. I don't want to talk to him. I couldn't give a crap. But I think it's really neat.
Right.
You know what I mean? For me, it was my grandmother. She knew a lot about Dick Tracy, and it scared and confused me because that woman was a maniac. The fact that she consistently remembered my name was very impressive, much less that she remembered who Flat Top was and that he died by drowning.
Well, Dick Tracy is also given, he's the one that brought in rogues galleries. That's why Bob Kane stole all the villains. Not the idea of
for a minute.
villains.
I was like, how will I have to challenge the claim that Bob Kane did anything of worth or good or creativity?
Well,
but you immediately did say steal the villains.
Yeah,
so you stayed consistent
because
consistent to the
Dick
truth.
Tracy had like Flat Top and Mumbles and all the other guys.
I have shamefully told this to folks before, but I will say it again, that when the Dick Tracy movie was coming out and LJN was putting out their hit release, Dick Tracy the video game, in the way that I think all genre enthusiasts will, the cultural timing, I would dare say the zeitgeist of that summer was such that the Dick Tracy movie was coming out. And there's an advertising machine and a nostalgia machine trying to build enthusiasm for Dick Tracy.
I loved it.
And I fed into it like a pathetic simp.
Yeah.
My house was filled with trades full of Dick Tracy garbage.
Oh, wow.
And there was a time when I could, without fail, and this didn't impress anyone. It impressed me, but it impressed no one else. So no one that mattered was hurt in any way by this lack of knowledge. The only person who mattered was quite happy with it. I could tell you every one of the grotesques that Dick Tracy fought in order, and I can't tell you the first 10 presidents of the United States of America. So in short, I will simply tell you the first of them was a gentleman by the name of Frank Red Drum, who put a piece of cheesecloth over his ugly features, becoming the blank, the first true grotesque. And of course, the most popular grotesque was Flat Top. People who don't know a thing about Dick Tracy know about Flat Top. But I think my favorite was a fellow by the name of Flyface, who stank and flies were constantly crawling all over his face. I loved the grotesques because, and this is something I've heard only once said about a comic property, and it was someone talking about the Doom Patrol, and they said, I always liked the Doom Patrol because they scared me. Dick Tracy was the thing that I liked because it scared me.
Yeah.
There's something so raw and I know it's trite, but gross about the grotesques.
When I was a kid,
There's a guy who he lost a lot of weight. I can sympathize. So he's got lots of extra skin hanging off of him. So he used his throat as a wallet, and that was his power. That was his character.
Prune Face too had a he was
Here's what people forget: Prune Face. He was just wrinkly.
right.
His actual gimmick, he's a prune. He's a frigging Nazi.
Yeah.
He's smuggling Zyklon gas.
Oh, that's
and we have him on children's programming.
Well, that's
He's a very good villain, but he's no Mrs. Prune Face.
and that's one of the things that I've not researched enough to actually know this or not. But
Yeah.
I remember that era of Dick Tracy where like they're trying to make a franchise out of this. The cartoon show,
Yep.
the
Well.
movie.
Well, my friend, I certainly don't want to be accused of falling back on material, but within the past year or so, I might have been chatting on a podcast, and the conversation took us to the Dick Tracy cartoon. So for the benefit of our beloved hangers-on enthusiasts
Right.
and foes, I will suggest to you that in all of God's green earth, there is nothing more offensive than the Dick Tracy cartoon.
Oh wow, okay.
Now, do you have any kind of vivid memory or knowledge of the Dick Tracy?
No, I just
cartoon?
remember it existing and me not liking it. I
Well,
loved the
well,
movie.
good.
I,
You're on the right side of history.
Yeah,
my friend.
I loved the movie. Loved the movie.
Are you serious?
Yeah, well, because what year?
I'm not going to chide you for that, Paul. That's brave.
what year?
man.
What year did that come out? Do you remember? Off the top of
It
your
would
head?
have been what, 87? Because it was the year after Batman.
It would have been 90 because Batman was 89.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
See, like I said, I'm not an issue numbers kind of guy.
S-
It was the year after Batman because the two big movies that were fighting it out to be that year's Batman were Days of Thunder and Dick Tracy.
Oh yeah, so I obviously saw Dick Tracy. So I was either 8 or 9 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and 8 or 9-year-old Paul was loving Batman comics or whatever.
Sure. And you say, hey, here's a guy who fights villains.
Right, and
This
there
is
were
the next hero I'm going to get
tons
behind.
of villains. And then you see Madonna, and you're like, I feel funny because that is
On
the-
that day, young Paul became a man.
that was
appropriate enough watching a movie, half of whose title was Tracy.
right, Dick Tracy.
Yes, thank you, Paul.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
leaving something to the
Yeah,
imagination,
sorry.
Paul. You were squeamish earlier. I was trying to keep things family, Paul.
I mean, it's still fine.
Keep talking about your dick.
It was so. That is probably, and I've said this before. I haven't watched every Madonna movie, but
Okay.
that's the hottest Madonna's ever looked in a movie. Like there is no other movie she's looked that
Paul,
good.
as a gay man, I will agree that yes, I too have seen every movie Madonna has been in, and yes, it is the hottest she has ever been.
That's the hottest she's ever been. I remember
Glory to the Madonna.
and as a kid being mad that Dick Tracy didn't end up with her, and as an adult be like, no, Tess is pretty awful. He should have been with Breathless Mahoney.
See, the wisdom of the young sometimes holds.
Yeah, no, I knew that pretty much going.
Here was my only gripe with the Dick Tracy movie. Being a villain enthusiast nerd, now I'm a couple of years older than you.
They kind of just showed up in the background.
They just showed up in the
Yeah,
background.
I agree.
But here's the thing. Here's what time and maturity have brought Keith Evolution Field. It's a better movie than I gave it credit for at the time.
Oh yeah.
My general disappointment from it didn't come from anything the movie offered. It came from the fact that I willingly gave myself over to the cult of personality of this thing and was expecting something that just wasn't there. This was a gangster story about gangsters. It just so happens the gangsters are ugly. I'm watching it. I don't know what the hell I thought the villains were going to do. Ultimately, didn't they do enough? They held guns and they shot at Dick Tracy, and they looked gross. You're not going to have a weird level of development and subplots about, a vitamin maker and mad hillbillies and Jack LaLanne and quicksand in your story about Mumbles. You're just gonna have Mumbles shoot off a gun.
Well, that and then you have the only cool thing was having Al Pacino be the mobster. So good.
Not only was it good, but here's the funny thing about that: they did some sort of lifetime achievement thing on an Oscars not so long
for
ago.
Warren Beatty.
No. For him.
Oh,
and,
Al Pacino.
And they've got the camera trained on him. They're going to show you scenes of The Godfather. They're going to show you scenes of Serpico. They're going to show you scenes of Cruising. And at the end of all of it, he's totally unfazed. He's sitting there. It's Pacino. He's watching his body of work. They start showing his role as Big Boy.
Big boy, yeah.
The tears. he starts mouthing along every line of dialogue. Like, this is the movie that melts the heart of the master. It's fascinating when you see the gears
Because
of a creative. This was the passion project. And suddenly I was like, no, I'll never say a bad word about this movie again, because now I see the level of craft, commitment, and the friggin' tears this man would shed for this odd ham role as a quote-unquote supervillain.
Well, because he's in a different movie than everybody else. And
Very much so.
He's not in the same, like, PG, like, oh, boss, what are we going to do next? You know, that's not what he's in.
And appropriately enough, who are our big performances there? It's him and it's Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman steals every scene as his version of Mumbles.
Oh,
It
yeah.
really works.
Yeah.
There's just something so manic and nervous about that movie that it doesn't work. It's
My-
like everybody knows this isn't Batman and we're trying our best to pretend it is.
Well,
you feel it in every delivery of Beatty.
Also, a young child Paul, hated kid characters.
YCP.
And most people I've talked to, no one, like, the kid side character.
Now, see, Paul, this is why it kills me that you're married, because this could be the foundation of a relationship. I, too, despise child characters.
Hate 'em.
In anything.
Hate them.
Especially children's movies.
Yes. No, I don't hate them if
And
they're...
I'm not saying that ironically. I don't want kids in any role ever.
Right. I don't mind
Shoot them all into the sun. That's the role children are born to play.
Well, see, I'm not maybe that extreme.
I'm being silly, but I actually do agree with you 100%.
But
Shoot them into a star other than the sun.
Yeah, I'm gonna legally
Distance counts.
I'm gonna legally say I do not agree with that. That is a
Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Paul does not believe all children should be shot into the sun. This has been an official Keithsplanation.
Right. I think that kids like Goonies, because they're just kids in a movie, so they're not sidekicks to like I want to watch Dick Tracy. I don't want to see him be friends with kid and adopt.
That's
kid.
the point I'm
It's
more or less trying to get at with my talk of
I don't really care
sun-based
about that.
genocide is just that. If it's Goonies, if they're kids that are being portrayed in a non-pretentious, non-precocious nature, that they're swearing, they're thugs, they want to look at Playboy, they may have a variety of wacky inventions stored in their overcoat, and they're fighting gangsters who want to kill them, that's cool, because you're not talking down by their presence.
Right.
When Spawn is hanging out with a little boy and a dog, despite the fact that the lovely man who created him assured me on a making-of video that he would not allow Hollywood to infest his films with dogs or children, then I'm a little pissed.
Right. And that's what happened.
Not quite as bad as J.J. Abrams getting on movie screens and lying to us all about whether or not Khan is in his Star Trek movie, or telling us some bullcrap story about the supposed theft of a magical script for the last Star Wars movie.
Right.
But it's still a lie, so I can't accept it.
And that's my thing with, I came to see a Dick Tracy movie.
Oh.
Not a lot of that movie is about him and Tess adopting this kid, and there are plot points that are super important that this kid does, and I'm like, I don't care. I don't care. You have Dustin Hoffman as Mumbles, and you have wasn't a big actor was Pruneface and Flat Top.
Paul Sorvino was lips manless. He dies in the first 2 seconds of the movie.
Right, but that's huge.
Yeah.
And this also includes young cartoon characters like Scrappy Doo, who I would murder in a heartbeat if he actually existed in animated form.
In terms of the eternal myth, I do my best not to get pissed off by the idiot sidekicks who ruin everything.
My dear dum-dum.
Because I understand that in the fantasy archetype dynamic, you got your young hero, you got your pirate, you got your wizard, you got your chick, you got your pet, and then you have your familiar. You have your Snarf, you have your Orko.
What have I done?
Hey, you have your Dick Tracy Jr. If I've got the choice, I'm gonna take Dick Tracy Jr. over Orko. Dick beats Orko any day.
Orko was also. I actually didn't mind Snarf too much, but when they did Snarf episodes, I'm like, I'm out. I can't watch this.
If Snarf is going to fly a ship or pilot a tank, this is not in my head canon.
Right. That's and for some reason Hollywood. Do they still believe that? I don't think there's any modern equivalents of that.
Well, at this point, it's sort of this unfortunate Shaggy Dog thing, isn't it? Because now we're in this position where so much of the mass media stuff is based on nostalgia. So you want to deliver these things from the 70s and 80s with at least some appearance of all of their facets. So any version of Thundercats we get is going to have a snarf in it. I suppose this is as good a time as any to say, not the current thing that I guess calls itself Thundercats.
Oh, that died a horrible death.
Oh, did it?
Yeah,
Thank God.
It died
But the
a
thing
horrible
before it, the one that was on
pretty
Netflix,
good.
was exceptional.
Yeah, it was pretty
and
good.
it had a very good snarf.
Just quiet.
That's all I'll say
It
about
was-
that.
It wasn't sentient. It was
No,
just a snarf.
it's just a critter.
Yeah.
And if the familiar is just a critter, I'm happy. But on the subject of over-familiaring of cartoons, even though you wouldn't normally throw shade at this, because it's not really what you're talking about. It's not Spawn with a puppy.
Right.
I feel that Disney, as an entity, has gotten to a point where their need to put familiars in every movie, in multiple, has reached a critical point that is terrifying to me, and it needs to stop.
Right.
Now, for those of you who don't know what I mean when we're saying familiars, it comes from the idea that it comes to us from days of yore, and especially of pagan myth and belief, that those who walk the path of the dark world, that wizards and witches and all the rest of it, as part of their process of service to the unknown, would place some measure of their spirit, their intellect, or their power into an animal, an assistant, either a small demon, a pet. Most notably, of course, our most universal symbol of the familiar being a little black cat hanging out in a witch's house. So that is the archetype that is trying to be fulfilled whenever we put a dumb kid or a stupid animal into something. It is what it is. We're trying to recreate Thundercats. Well, we got Snarf coming along with it. Kevin Smith is doing something he calls He-Man. It's going to have an Orko and a Battle Cat and all the rest in it. Disney puts out a new movie. There are 15 different sentient animals all riding each other beside, I don't know, Encanto. There's no movie Disney
Right.
puts out now that doesn't have 3 or 4 different cute critters scuttling along. You can make an argument for that balance with one critter because it's the sworn companion to the hero. And in this way, it is the familiar. It is an assistant to the person who is finding their way on the glory road, the hero's journey.
And I'll take you with this.
If the horse is being ridden by a chicken and a flying carpet and a monkey and a fez, it's a little too much.
Right. Right.
It would be like 10 Dick Tracy Jr.'s
Right.
blocking
And-
poor Tracy and Tess.
And Battle Cat wouldn't be the familiar. It'd be Cringer, who I also
Very
hated,
much so.
who I also hated as a child.
You know, as much as the world attacked the poor Kevin Smith project, I'm not going to tell you it was good, but I will tell you it was the one moment where I said this he got right was Cringer had dignity. It was what's his face there, Mr. Root, an exceptional actor he does tons of voice, does all those Coen Brothers movies. He brought a certain gravitas.
Sure.
And I would say Tony Todd brought a certain gravitas to whoever the hell he played. Well, Ghostface, Skullboy. I'm not a He-Man guy.
I didn't watch.
Oh,
the
Paul.
He-Man one.
Oh, you missed something. How will you appreciate all of the hateful people on YouTube
Oh,
that are
yeah.
calling for the death of poor Kevin Smith? I didn't particularly care for it, but I didn't think it was a train wreck. But then again, I'm not an invested He-Man guy. I just use He-Man figures to build action figure conversions. I don't feel I really have a horse in the race.
Have you watched the 2000s He-Man?
It was neat.
That was awesome.
Those were all comic guys.
That was really, really
Yes.
good. Yeah.
That was solid stuff. Who worked on that? It was
That was Joe Kelly and Joe K. I think. I mean, I thought.
Oh,
it
that was a Man of Action
I thought
thing?
it was Man of Action.
Oh, I thought it was some of the more anime influenced people, like the ones who what's the studio does all the Street Fighter stuff.
The Devil's Due guys.
I thought it was more
Oh,
those guys, but I could be totally wrong because I never saw any of it.
I could be wrong. I haven't seen it since it first got out, and Cartoon Network canceled it. Like they cancel everything.
Yes, they do.
Um.
Hey, that brings us to something since we've come upon comics through this discussion. A cartoon that I think had the finest familiar in all the land in it, the Green Lantern cartoon on the Cartoon Network. You must have very complicated feelings about that cartoon.
Talking about
as a Green Lantern enthusiast.
you talking about the 3D animated one?
What other cartoon?
Yeah,
Paul?
yeah. I understand what they were trying to go for with that cartoon. I did not like it, but I think it's more of the style of animation.
All right.
I think I've never liked, the only 3D animated cartoon I've ever liked was Transformers Beast Wars, which looks horribly dated now.
Yes, it does, but it was an exceptional cartoon.
But everything else I don't like. And the Green Lantern cartoon suffered, for me personally, And also, they made weird choices that I didn't get.
Well, that's something, is that they did make weird choices. They made
The anti-monitor thing was really...
But I liked the choices they made. As much as they changed a lot of things to where I would never bring them, I was open to it. Even the anti-monitor.
I like...
For those who don't know, there was an animated CGI series on the Cartoon Network a few years back, Green Lantern. It was when that character was enjoying a meteoric rise in popularity thanks to the efforts of Mr. Jeff Johns. And this cartoon was the answer to that. And it was an oddly simple story they chose.
Yeah.
They made a very small galaxy. And I thought that there was a certain brave choice there in that someone else might be intimidated, dwarfed, or paralyzed by, okay, the Green Lantern Corps is this thing made of millions of aliens, many of whom are established, involved characters. How do we get at the core of this and translate it in such a way that we can sell a simple pool of action figures to a new generation of kids? And I think that they made brave choices. There is a certain modern voice in comics now that is half talking to the target child audience. Yes, you can all debate that and send me angry mail, but that is always going to be the core target. And then you try to tell a universal enough story with enough adult aesthetic or informed enough by adult audience values that it can work for both. And I think that it didn't find the right balance there. You know, if an ongoing and major plot line of your children's cartoon is the building sexual tension between a Red Lantern and that show's familiar, a cliche, innocent but sexy female robot, that's not what makes Green Lantern work.
That's what I mean. Like,
so yeah, I agree with you on that point.
And they handled that.
But plot choices like the Anti-Monitor, that I could deal with a little better.
Well, it was weird.
Spider Guild runs prisons. That's kind of cool.
Well, I get what they were going for, the toy aspect, but they're in a spaceship, so I immediately hate it. Because I hate Green Lanterns and spaceships.
You're 100% correct.
It's in the cosmos, not connected to Earth. You've already lost me. And you don't need...
And this is one of the reasons that young Paul and I are spirit brothers. Because you base anything anywhere than Earth, I tend to hate it like poison. Right. And that having been said, if you base it in a jungle, most deserts, or underwater, I also want nothing to do with it. I'll read Aquaman all day, but you put him in the middle of Manhattan, then I'm happy.
And I'm kind of the same way. I think Marvel has a better cosmos. Because I love Star Trek and I love Star Wars. So the Marvel universe feels like more of a defined universe.
Sure. As much as modern creators do like to blow up everything that matters in that universe, I forgive it because then the next author tends to ignore it or just name the next throne world.
Well, and that's
Ahala 2.
And as much as I love DC...
But yeah, it stays pretty consistent.
Yeah, DC unfortunately have, like, here are the jellyfish people, and here are the cat people. And
well, there's too much of a want not to go into the back catalog and research, but just say, I can draw an alien.
Right.
This looks like Star Wars.
Right.
And that's what's kind of diluted or over-flooded DC
And that was
space.
the Green Lantern cartoon.
Now, that having been said, we were discussing superherodom. Whatever shortfalls may have existed in various media for your Green Lantern, I'm sure you felt a great sense of victory and hope when Justice League Task Force was released for the Super Nintendo and Genesis systems back in the 90s.
I actually love that game.
Of course you do.
Because
I had a feeling you would, Paul, because you, my friend, are a simp. What do you love about that ugly, awkward, terrible fighting game? Is it the involvement of Elrond/Despero? Is that what turns you on, seeing Despero on the television? Because I got to tell you, The Flash just wasted a season on the CW of dealing with a character they called Despero, and it didn't make me happy. Because so you tell me what special alchemy existed within that edgelord piece of garbage that turned you on.
Because it's such a bizarre game. To be like, this is a Justice League game, and it's...
Do you remember the roster? Because other than Elrond Despero, I don't. Was Fire in it?
No, it's...
How about Beefeater?
The Trinity is in it.
Okay, thank God.
And
was there a lantern in it?
No.
My entire founding thesis was flawed. I apologize.
And I think Flash...
Did it have the Aquaman with the hook hand? I think it might have.
You know, for some reason, I own this.
What an episode! Paul reveals his theory of a time-traveling rabbit, his history of cartography, and regales us with the story of almost buying an action figure. Keith explains his disdain for Sonic, mere feet from his Sonic Lego construction. And what of the children, Keith? Shoot them into the sun, he says. Where will the conversation lead? What revelations will we discover? What mysteries will be solved? Find out next time on Infinite Geek Talk. Infinite Geek Talk is brought to you by Infinite Heroes Comics, Cards, and Collectibles in Watertown, Connecticut, and Gorilla Valley Games. Infinite Geek Talk is a Rat's Nest production, recorded and engineered by Rich Johnson in the Rat's Nest Studio.